Dr. Campbell is board certified in forensic psychology by the American Board of Professional Psychology. Dr. Campbell's publications have appeared in various scientific and professional journals, including the American Journal of Forensic Psychology, the American Journal of Forensic Psychiatry, Behavioral Sciences and the Law, Issues in Child Abuse Accusations, Journal of Forensic Psychology Practice, goes on, Journal of Systems Therapies, Michigan Bar Journal, Michigan Lawyers Weekly, and Psychotherapy. He is also the author or co-author of 6 books. Terry, welcome.
Let me begin by commenting on the title of my presentation, Reducing Parental Conflicts Between Divorced Spouses and Walking Through the Valley of Death. Many years ago, more years than I care to admit, I played junior hockey. And on occasion, my coach, Father James Enright, would sit down next to me in the dressing room between periods, and he would say very quietly, loud enough only for me to hear, "Though you walk through the valley of death, you shall not fear, because you are the meanest blank blank in the valley." That was Father Enright's way of saying to me, it's time to get physical. Mental health professionals who are attempting to contend therapeutically with alienation also find themselves walking through the valley of death because these cases can be therapist killers. For a mental health professional dealing with alienation, the issue is not to be the meanest blank blank in the valley. The agenda is to be the most flexible blank blank in the valley. Most of what I'm going to talk about this morning is informed by solution-focused therapy using techniques of structural strategic family therapy as developed by Salvador Minuchin and Jay Haley. The emphasis will be more on what needs to be done to establish reunification than why. Yes, I will consider issues of why, but what is the single most important issue in terms of what needs to be done to realize reunification between the child or the children and the target parent. Now, assume that consistent with what Dr. Burnett talked about yesterday, we have a well-documented case of contact refusal. Also consistent with what Dr. Burnett spoke about yesterday, we have tested out various hypotheses other than alienation. Some of those hypotheses or none of those hypotheses may have any support, but the hypothesis that stands out is alienation. Per Dr. Sauber's comments of yesterday, we've tested out also, are we dealing with alienation or abuse? And we come to the conclusion we're dealing with alienation. Consistent with Dr. Darnell's comments of yesterday, we've proceeded ahead to obtain a judge's order that will support our therapeutic endeavors. Moving ahead to Dr. Warnklein's comments this morning, We've also considered, is this case a divorce matter that yet is unresolved? In other words, do we have ongoing legal proceedings in this divorce case addressing considerations of property settlement, child support, child custody, and so forth? If all of those issues remain up in the air and have not yet been resolved, I would advise you, do not get involved in therapy at that point in time. There are too many unresolved forces pulling this family in different directions that your influence as a therapist will not be able to compete with those other forces and those other agenda. So what we're saying at this point is, as a therapist, do not venture into reconciliation therapy without being well prepared. Because if you are not sufficiently well enough prepared, you're going to get undermined, you're going to get negated, you're going to get killed. Now, to begin with, I recommend individual sessions with each parent. Also, consistent with what other presenters have spoken about, is if the parents are remarried, you must include the step-parent with either parent you're going to see. If either parent is involved in a serious committed relationship with a live-together partner, that partner must be involved in your sessions. Because if you don't involve a step-parent or a live-together partner in your sessions, you're creating the risk of that individual sabotaging you behind the scenes, and you won't even know what's going on. So now you start out in an individual session with the presumably alienating parent and that parent's partner or new spouse, if those events have ensued. And you want to begin to join with that parent. As Dr. Darnell and others have pointed out, do not make the mistake of establishing a one-sided alliance with the target parent. That will come back to haunt you because you'll blow away any appearance of objectivity. So now you're working with the alienated parent, and again, in structural strategic therapy terms, you want to join that parent. You want to convey to that parent, I understand what you've been going through. And you can explain to that parent, divorce is inevitably an arduous, agonizing experience. Divorce is hell. And I know you've been through hell and back. And divorce also presents you with all kinds of ambiguity. You were not familiar with lawyers and courts and judges in the legal system, and you didn't know what to expect. And the procedures that went on weren't always well explained to you. And under these circumstances, your anxiety level soars. When anybody who's put in an ambiguous situation where they don't know what to expect, they get nervous. They get real nervous. And when people get real nervous, sometimes we don't think clearly. We don't do what psychologists call make accurate discriminations. Worried, anxious people will jump to worst case scenarios. And you say to the parent, have you ever heard the story about we have anxious people and non-anxious people? hear the following statement. The doctor examined little Emma's growth. And now non-anxious people will conclude that the doctor examined the child's height or stature. Do you know how anxious people interpret that statement? They'll come to the conclusion that the doctor examined the child's tumor. Again, demonstrating how worried, anxious people struggling with ill-defined, ambiguous situations will leap to worst-case scenarios. And a great deal of that has happened to you. You see, you don't have much contact, face-to-face contact with your ex-spouse. So you are in a situation that's new to you. You're a single parent. In most cases, you can say you have not been a single parent before. And your ex-spouse has not been a single parent before. Thus, the two of you are in a situation where you're not sure what to expect from each other. You do know that your ex-spouse was a significant disappointment as a marital partner. That's why you're sitting here in my office. And it's very, very easy to make the leap from he was cold, indifferent, and uncaring as a spouse, therefore he is cold, indifferent, and uncaring as a single parent. But really, you don't know what he's like as a single parent. You haven't had that many opportunities to observe him. So, what we begin to suggest to the alienating parent is, let's step back and see if we can revise our thinking a little and help you overcome your anxiety, which is not your fault. Because divorce, dealing with children, is in and of itself a paradoxical situation. The paradox is, family law professionals will say to you, it is better, it is preferable for your children to have the benefit of cooperative parents who can communicate effectively. And in order for you to realize this cooperative outcome, we will give you an adversarial procedure within which to realize it, because whoever fights the best wins. So to begin with, dealing with child custody, child visitation matters in the context of divorce presents all kinds of Alice in Wonderland characteristics. And you can join with alienating parents in terms of, this is what you've been enduring. This is the kind of craziness with which you've been struggling, and it's not your fault. What we're doing at this point is really a process of a figure ground reversal. In terms of persistent conflicts and disputes between ill-tempered divorcing parents, they stand out as figure for each other. All they can see when they think about the problems is their counterpart. All they can think about is their counterpart. And the Alice in Wonderland characteristics of divorce fade into the background. Well, one of the first strategic moves you can make is to begin to switch that figure ground phenomenon. And where you say to them, look, at this point in time, you are becoming a victim of divorce. And there's some realities about divorce that you need to understand. That is the whole set of players in the divorce scene. Judges, attorneys, friend of the court personnel, and even the occasional forensic psychologist or family law psychologist. When all is said and done, there are profound limits on how much we care. Have you ever heard of compassion fatigue? When it comes to compassionately identifying with the agony that you've endured, we only have so much compassion to go around. And beyond that, we will exhaust ourselves and put our own welfare in jeopardy. Consequently, what's happening is your divorce problems, your child custody problems, your visitation problems amount to another day at the office for the professionals who are involved. Now, I think I'm going to like your kids. I think you got neat kids. But I'm not going to care as much about your kids as I love my grandchildren. My grandchildren are wonderful. You want to hear about my grandchildren? So the issue is this. Who is going to be more committed to the welfare of your children? Family law professionals and mental health professionals? Or you and your ex-spouse? And the related question is, okay, in terms of this whole situation, who's going to be in charge? Will the circumstances of divorce take charge of you? Or will you take charge of the circumstances of divorce? Now, this is a theme that you play again and again and again, because as you move forward, the next step is going to be asking the alienating parent, what needs to happen in order for you to tell your children that visitation is okay? Now, in 90% of cases, when you first raise that question, you're going to get resistance, opposition, and all kinds of argument. And when you encounter the resistance, the opposition, and all the argument, you respond to the alienating parent in terms of, you're being a victim of divorce again. Divorce is victimizing you. No, stop. I want to help you. I want to help you take charge of the divorce dynamics instead of the divorce dynamics taking charge of you. Now, this kind of an intervention is such, it is not inherently accusatory. It does not invite the defensiveness of the alienating parent. And it says to the alienating parent that you as therapists are on that parent's side, and you want to assist that parent. Then we move to the question that I already previewed. Asking the alienating parent what needs to happen in order for you to tell the children that visitation with your counterpart is okay. And at this point, when I was doing this work, I'd have a big chart in my office where I would write down the expectations of the alienating parent with this qualification. I would write down the reasonable expectations of the alienating parent after I had assisted that parent to express his or her expectations in a more reasonable manner. One of the things that I would sometimes suggest to alienating parents at this point with a twinkle in my eye was, please understand we don't do personality transplants. Yep. I can't handle that. I'm not qualified to do surgery. But what we want is to identify realistic expectations in the here and now. Expectations such as, I want him to understand how horrible he was. And there the appropriate response is, stop. You're becoming a victim of divorce again. Those divorce dynamics are sneaking up on you. And what's happening, because the divorce dynamics are sneaking up on you, you are proposing to me that somehow we should change the past. We can't change what has happened in the past. It is done, it is over. We can only address what is happening now and what is happening in the future. So this is a theme that you stick to again and again and again. We must focus on here and now and the future. And to the extent that you get distracted from here and now and or the future, you are again being a victim of divorce. Let me help you so you're no longer being victimized. Then at this point, you can begin to get some reasonable expectations. I want him to not assassinate my character when he speaks to the children. And at this point, you want to think a little bit like a behaviorist in terms of you say, oh yeah, you're right. You're right. As often as you can say you're right, that grabs a client's attention. Client wants to know what he or she is right about. And you explain to the client, you're right. And in other words, the outcome we want is we want the ex-spouse to speak of you in positive terms. Well, yes, that's what I meant. And because you want the ex-spouse to speak of you in positive terms, then, I can expect that you would also speak of your ex-spouse in positive terms too. Well, I can start trying. Well, that's good. That's good. I mean, you can't change what happened in the past. You can only start now. And you're willing to change. Then you explain, this may be the first session or the second session, you explain to the custodian, now our next step is going to be where you explain your expectations to your ex-spouse in a session where your ex-spouse is here. In other words, you inform the alienating parent, going to see you and the ex-spouse together. I would strongly recommend that it is imperative to see the two parental figures together if you're doing reunification therapy, because if you're doing reunification therapy, you are attempting to change the dynamics of a two-person relationship. And I don't know how you alter the dynamics of a two-person relationship if you only see those people one at a time. For instance, as I stand here before you this morning, you have a sense of what I'm like as a psychologist, and you have a sense of what I'm like as a public speaker. As I stand here before you this morning, you have no idea of what I'm like as a spouse or as a grandparent. And you really could not understand what I'm like as a spouse and a grandparent unless you saw me interacting with my wife and or my grandchildren. And the commonality is, in both situations, I'm an absolute pushover. When you broach the whole subject of, our next step will be working with you and your ex together. Oh, it's protest city. I can't be in the same room with him. It is impossible. I'll probably throw up. I'll have a bucket available. This is what I mean by flexibility. And more seriously, you can deal with these kinds of protests by responding to the alienating parent in terms of, over the course of this appointment here in my office, you have been a reasonable, rational, open-minded person who is willing to consider possibilities of change. Now, when you say that, you may be stretching reality to some degree. However, that kind of message directed to an alienating parent amounts to what Jay Haley used to call the attribution of a noble reputation. That is to say, when you attribute a socially desirable, noble reputation to another individual in glowing terms, you create a situation where that individual feels compelled to live up to the reputation that you have just attributed to her or him. And then you can follow up by explaining to the alienating parent, now, as reasonable, rational, open-minded as you have been this morning, I think you're being straightforward with me. I think you are. But you could be doing just a very good act. And what I've seen in my office today is only a good act. That's fine. That's okay. Because we can all perfect our acts over time. And with the passage of time, we can become a master of the roles in which we're acting. I explained to them, I used to be a self-doubting psychologist, but I developed a confident act. I think I do it pretty well. So if when I see you with your ex-spouse, and if your reasonable, rational, open-minded attitude is no more than an act, that's okay. And over time, you can perfect your act. And then what you know and what remains unspoken is what people pretend at one point in time can become very real at a later point in time. Then you have your next session with the target parent. Do not over-identify with the target parent. Do not over-sympathize with the target parent. Alienation cases rarely involve considerations that are all black and all white. And boy, I'm glad that most of the people in this audience are mental health professionals, because when I say this, I piss off target parents to no end. But it needs to be said. When we are dealing with alienation and considering the dynamics of target parents and alienating parents, the fact is these parental figures alternate back and forth, taking turns, both influencing and being influenced by each other. Show me a case of alienation where a target parent has had no influence whatsoever, and I want to write that case up because we're going to make history. I've never seen it happen before. Also at this point, you want to consider the potential that an old supervisor of mine, and a wonderful genius, Dr. Judith Landau, who's now located in Boulder, Colorado, has developed link therapy. And Dr. Landau has developed link therapy for all of the work that she's done with substance abuse. But link therapy is also very much applicable to dealing with alienation. In link therapy, what you want to do is to identify links to this family that will adopt your treatment agenda. In other words, we want to identify other people who will support the idea of reunification. Now, considering link therapy is one of those propositions where it's risky, but if you get a couple of good, solid links, the payoff is wonderful. Payoff is wonderful. Now, what's risky about attempting link therapy is you can run into a fiercely, blindly loyal ally of the alienating parent. And that blindly loyal ally of the alienating parent will just cut you off at the knees. So if you're considering link therapy, you ask the parents, who could help you? Who could assist you with this whole process of undertaking the changes that we need to undertake? Who can help you with undertaking the changes that the judge has ordered? And then you interview the link by himself or herself. You never include the link in therapy without having interviewed them first, because you could be in for some really unpleasant surprises. And in interviewing and assessing the link figure or link person, the question is, will this individual support and endorse reunification, or is this individual a blindly loyal ally of the alienating parent? Link persons ultimately, if they will support the therapeutic agenda, make the therapist's job easier. Years ago, I worked with a colleague who will leave unnamed for reasons you'll see in a moment. And he had worked with major figures in structural and strategic family therapy like Salvador Minuchin, Chloe Madonis, Braulio Montalvo, and others. And he explained to me that he finally got it. He described himself as a neurotic, high-achieving Jewish kid from Chicago who knew if he was going to succeed, he had to work hard. And then he said to me, I was wrong. He said, look at Minuchin and Montalvo and Madonis. These are all people who grew up in well-to-do South American families, and they grew up with servants. He said, growing up with servants, they learned how to get the servants to do the work in the family. And he says, as family therapists, they're doing the same thing. That is, they get the family to do the work for them. And if you can identify the proper links in the context of reunification therapy, you can get those links to do a lot of work for you, and your efforts will generalize more readily beyond your treatment sessions. Then, next step is you see the parents together. And on your board, you've got the reasonable expectations, and you've run those expectations past the target parent in a previous session, so you know that the target parent will endorse and affirm the reasonable expectations. And then you see how civil, how rational, how reasonable can these two people be. And you may encounter another paradox. You can have situations which will leave you a little bit drop-jawed in terms of a very rapid reconciliation between the parents and a demonstrated ability to communicate and problem solve with each other, and they do it right in front of you. And the paradox is this: when that kind of rapid progress ensues, you've got to issue a polite warning to the parents. And the polite warning is, A, you two are doing exceedingly well. You're doing everything that needs to be done. And specifically, let's look at what you're doing well. We have outcomes here where the two of you are communicating on behalf of your children's welfare, pursuing goals that you agree on. That's what's happening here, isn't it? Now stop and think. When two people work together, pursuing a mutual goal, and do so successfully, will those two people feel positive and at least somewhat attracted to each other? And at this point, the parents will often begin to smile. Because I'll jump in and I'll add to it, please, I know this is not a high likelihood event. Please promise me that you're not going to develop any unrealistic feelings of affection for each other. And they'll look at me like I'm crazy. And I'll say, stop. Stop and think about the dynamics of your previous marriage. In your marriage, you had episodes where the two of you would come together very intensely, very passionately, caring very deeply for each other, but that closeness, for whatever reasons, could not be sustained. A nasty, ill-tempered fight would ensue in order for the two of you to get distance from each other. Over a period of time, you couldn't tolerate the distance any longer, so you would approach each other, resuming a period of intense, passionate closeness, followed by a big fight and going apart. Please, let's spare ourselves the big fight by not entertaining any feelings of affection for each other at this point in time. You are co-workers. No more, no less. And as co-workers, the union rules prohibit any inappropriate exchanges of affection. Also, when you approach these parents in this manner, you will get them to begin to smile. You may get them to begin to laugh. And that is also a desirable outcome, where they can begin to laugh as they say, this situation is not as horrible and serious as we thought it was. Now, also in the background, prior to seeing the parents together, you want to see the kids. And I think it was Dr. Workinen who talked about sibling relationships. And oh yes, they are exceedingly important. If you are dealing with what I call the big sister phenomenon, that is to say, if you have a sibship where the oldest sibling is a girl, she's the assistant mama. Well, I guarantee it. And she will provide leadership for the other siblings. I have found that if you respond in a straightforward fashion to kids in an age-appropriate manner, in terms of, look, there was a time when you loved both mom and dad. And then their marriage blew up and all kinds of problems started. And I think that you would prefer a situation where mom would say to you, it's okay to have a good relationship with dad. And I think you would prefer a situation where dad would say to you, it's very much okay to have a good relationship with mom. At this point, in my experience, the vast majority of kids in mild to moderate cases of alienation say yes. Now, in severe cases of alienation, I'll have kids doing this to me. But in mild to moderate cases of alienation, those kids will agree with me or I can bring them around. And consistent with what Dr. Darnell talked about yesterday, I'll begin to talk to the kids metaphorically. We'll talk about Switzerland. Well, I ask them if they're familiar with the history of Switzerland. And most of them aren't. And I explain to them, Switzerland has always been neutral. Switzerland will not align itself with any major powers in Europe. In World War I, they remained neutral. World War II, they remained neutral. Their attitude was, we'll sell you chocolate, you can put your money in our banks, but we're neutral. And kids kind of like that idea. It appeals to them. And I said, we could explain to mom and dad about Switzerland being neutral. And I said, have you ever seen the Swiss flag? Kids would say, no. I said, well, it has a red background with a white cross on it. I said, we could make you, or you could make your own miniature Swiss flags, like you might tape to a pencil or a pen. And if mom or dad starts bad-mouthing the other one, you could just wave your flag. And we'll explain to mom and dad what the flag waving means. And in a follow-up session where I had the parents and the one daughter in the session, and we're explaining to mom and dad how we're going to use the Swiss flag. And little 13-year-old Jenny, with this impish glint in her eye, says, Dr. Campbell, and I have another idea. And I said, I said, and Jenny, what's your idea? She says, I could wave the flag, she says, or I could yodel. At that point, Dr. Campbell dissolved in laughter, and the parents began to crack up. And as later on, the parents explained to me that at that point, the ridiculousness of their past conflicts started to become very, very apparent to them. Finally, we also need to contend with allies of the alienating parent. First of all, you have to identify the allies. And you can respond to the alienating parent in terms of, let's say, we're getting this situation turned around. Your child is having good visits with your ex-spouse. You're taking a position of, this is a good outcome. I said, do you have any friends or family members who are going to say to you, you're crazy. You're out of your mind. We can't let this go on. Almost without exception, every single time I've posed that question to an alienating parent, I've got an affirmative response. And then the next question is, who? Who is this person, or who are these people who are going to have problems accepting these changes? And so the alienating parent identifies them. My first response is to label the allies as additional victims of divorce and explain to the alienating parent, your anxiety, your struggles, your tragedies infected this other person. And you explain it in a non-judgmental fashion, reminding the alienating parent you were a victim of circumstances beyond your control. And as a result, these other people became victims of circumstances beyond their control. They became collateral damage. And they need your help. And so you plan a session where you see the alienating parent and at least one ally, if you think you can do it, 2 allies together, and you have the alienating parent apologize to the ally for having made the ally a victim of divorce, explaining, I was so overwhelmed by the unfamiliarity of what was happening. I didn't know what to anticipate. I couldn't understand it. I was scared to death. And my fear sucked you in, and I infected you with my fear. And I am so sorry that I did that. So again, the theme is, we're going to change behavior without indicting and without blaming. And if we persist very carefully in joining with people without indicting them, without blaming them, their capacity for change can really be quite astounding and surprising. Then the issue becomes one of, okay, once we have normalized change, how much longer do we need to see this family to sustain the change? This is where links or converted allies. You understand what I mean by a converted ally? Okay. It's where links and converted allies are exceedingly important. If you have obtained positive change, the family system is moving in a constructive direction, and you're not sure how much longer your influence is needed, you have a session with any positive links or converted allies, and you ask them. And typically, they will know better than you as therapists knows, because these links and these converted allies are spending more time with the parents and the kids than you do. So they have a broader sample of parental behavior. And you respond accordingly, with the understanding that if the situation arises, you will be available in the future, but you are nonetheless very confident that this family can sustain its own progress. Thank you.